two things, essentially. The first is basically the global economic situation and outlook. And the second is about Indonesia, quite obviously. We take a look at the world today. I think it's pretty clear that the freshwater economists, predominantly based in Chicago, have been very influential in shaping the economies around the world, particularly those in the US, in Europe, and also in Japan, where the paradigm of infusing liquidity into the system is the way out of difficulties. This is in contrast to the saltwater economist on the shores of the US, who would rather a more Keynesian approach of a more proactive government role in getting ways out of any difficult situation. The US, or the US economy, has gone through a bit of a slowdown, been able to muddle through with 1.5%, 2% growth rate. And it is viewed that it is probably growing at about 6 to 7% lower than what it should be. What it means is it's been growing at about $1 trillion less than what it should have in production on an annual basis. And $1 trillion means a lot to many of us in Asia. Whereas in Europe, we're seeing the trends of kicking the can down the road for the last few years, and it seems that it's likely to continue for another year or two. And the headwind of increasingly difficult fiscal postures by way of the high debt to GDP ratios and the seeming inability to create more fiscal space that would mean good for the millions of people, not only in Europe, but also around the world. China has felt it. They've been able to create so much capacity in view of the growing demand that would come from the developed economies in Europe and the US and also in Asia Pacific, increasingly in Africa and Latin America. But by way of the slowdown in the US and Europe, the capacity that was created runs at a lower utilization rate. As a result of which, they needed to reconfigure the economic structure to try to domesticate it a little bit more, a la Indonesia style. This seems to be working, but I think one must ask the question as to whether or not the demographics are going to be in support of that thinking. Because if you want to be more consumptive, you need to make sure that there is youth, that there is reproduction. Sort of what we've gone through in Indonesia the last few years. Demographically, Indonesia has been blessed, but demographically, Indonesia could be cursed too if we don't do anything good to the young people that enter the world. The BRICS, as you know, have been slowing down, with the exception of China coming down to 7.5%. Relative to the others, it's doing fantastically. And the BRIC countries, or the BRICS countries, have been over-relying on demands coming from Europe and the US, and some of them have been over-relying on commodities. Brazil, as a result, grew at less than 1% last year, and is trying to figure out a way. The world seems to lack and be in need of a new source of oracular economic wisdom. That is something what everybody's searching whether it's in Indonesia, Singapore, ASEAN, Asia Pacific, and the greater world. I had the opportunity and honor to meet up with my counterpart earlier today, Minister of Trade and Industry, and also Minister of Finance, to talk about how ASEAN can be more resilient in the face of all these. I can speak from a trade standpoint. There have been challenges. And we start out with the metaphor or analogy of these 159 countries that are trying to figure out a way to get from one place to another. They want to go from one place to another. Some have GPS capabilities, some don't. Some have a better transport system than others. And the guys that have a better transport system are waiting for the weather to clear out. And as they're waiting, the other guys who don't have GPS capabilities start moving. And they get lost, and they accidentally or coincidentally meet up in some cafe, in some rest area, and try to hook up and cut a deal. When they're cutting this deal, this is the spirit of bilateralism that we're seeing in many parts of the world, whether it's in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, or even in Europe. Some even go to the extent of a plurilateral understanding or undertaking. Some will take the regional approach in hopes that those things, whether it's bilateral, plurilateral, or regional, would be in complementarity and supportive of the spirit of multilateralism that would have been spearheaded at Doha. And that was 11 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. It's been very difficult to advance the agenda and spirit that would basically bridge the interest of the poor and those of the developing and those of the developed. It's a challenging time. Another example would be the initiative of some of the developed economies to go ahead with a Trans-Pacific Partnership Initiative. At the same time when Asian economies are trying to move ahead with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships, or RCEP, as we more popularly call it. RCEP is basically a culmination of a group of Asian countries made up of Japan, China, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand, trying to deepen and broaden the already signed free trade agreements with ASEAN, so that there is a thesis of investment, there is a thesis of capacity building. But unfortunately or fortunately, this sits on the back of a developing geopolitical situation, whether it relates to what's happening up north between Japan and China and Korea, and what's happening in the South China Sea, as we're seeing the U.S. trying to better re-engage the ASEAN population, the ASEAN countries and economies. I think we will find it very interesting in the next year, 2 or 3, as the RCEP and TPP go hand in hand. Singapore is participatory to both of these. Indonesia has taken a view that we're not ready to participate on TPP because we're just not yet ready to be able to quantify and ascertain as to whether or not this would be net beneficial to Indonesia. And to be quite candid with you, we just don't have the bandwidth, because we've got to get the bilaterals done with a few countries that we've started discussions and negotiations with, and we've got to focus our bandwidth on RCEP, which hopefully will go hand in hand with the culmination and realization of the ASEAN Economic Community by the end of 2015. The The ASEAN Free Trade Agreement is a beautiful, beautiful framework. This has promoted economic activities in all countries involved. Yes, there has been some issue in Indonesia with regards to the ASEAN-China free trade, but we've been able to manage, massage, and iron out the wrinkles. The politics got a little bit difficult because we were just sending coal and palm oil and getting handphones and laptops. We have to make sure that the domestic politics is manageable so that it becomes a sustainable thing between China and Indonesia through ASEAN. That, I think, has been able to be managed a lot better in the last couple of years, and we're hopeful that by infusing the investment thesis and increasing capacity in Indonesia through technological transfer and financial capital transfer, we'll be able to sustain it, and I do believe we will. Now, the trends of bilateralism, regionalism, plurilateralism are going to have to be in complementarity and supportive of the multilateralism. And it's key, because when we meet up in Bali later this year at APEC in October, and also the next ministerial conference for WTO in December, we've got to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. Policies that have been designed by countries to spur growth, to better the foundation for economic development, sometimes tend to get lost in translation. Because beliefs and policies are malleable. Malleable to the extent that the stronger do have the propensity to affect how things get perceived. That's the reality we got to live with. But I think if we stay steadfast with respect to the thesis, the narrative that we have agreed 11 years ago, I think we've got a chance. And that, I think, was reflected in the bit of success that we got in Vladivostok some months ago when we met up at the last APEC meeting. And in recent months, we've been able to progress the conversation on topics such as the LDC package, or the Least Developed Countries package, and the Trade Facilitations package for the WTO. That's the global stuff. The second is on Indonesia. At the end of Sukarno, or his regime, the GDP per capita of Indonesia was at a mere $400. Then Suharto took over. At the end of his term, the GDP per capita of Indonesia was $600. To be fair, Suharto actually brought it up to $1,200. But by way of the great financial crisis in Asia in 1998, things just got diluted. And it came down to $600. And the transition governments of Habibie, Megawati, Gus Dur brought the GDP per capita from $600 to about $1,100. Until 2004, when SBY, or Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, took over and started and continued the reform agenda that was started earlier. By the end of last year, Indonesia's GDP per capita was about $4,000. So SBY was able to quadruple the GDP per capita from the time he took over from Megawati. And if we were to extrapolate the economy until the end of his term in October 22nd next year, there is a good chance the GDP per capita of Indonesia would be about $5,000. So that would mean the quintupling of the GDP per capita of Indonesia within a 10-year period, ever since SBY took over from Megawati. We take a look at the fiscal posture. Indonesia may have some bragging rights. We run on a debt to GDP ratio of about 23%, and we've been running a budget deficit of about 1.5% each of the last few years. Pretty good, because I remember when I was a banker, when I used to make more money than I am now. Debt to GDP ratio was about 90%. Budget deficit was double digit. Inflation was about 70%. Last year's inflation was a little under 4%. In 2011 it was 3.5%. We've been able to manage inflation quite effectively and efficiently. It's funny when I tell people the only thing that worries me about inflation is the price of chili. The price of chili makes up a good chunk of the index for inflation. Tells you how much spicy food we eat. So, if we were to want to manage inflation, we just have to eat less spicy food. The other stuff is rice, which has been stable. The other stuff is fuel, which has been an issue for the last few months. I think from a monetary and fiscal standpoint, Indonesia stands pretty ready. And by the way, only 10 million people pay taxes in Indonesia. And we have a few more than 10 million people in our population. With only 10 million people and companies paying taxes, we've been able to reduce our debt to GDP ratio to 23%. We've been able to manage budget deficit at about 1.5%. We've been able to offer companies that have gone public to pay tax at a 20% tax rate. And our tax ratio has gone up to about 15.5% using the OECD methodology. Imagine if we were to be able to collect taxes from 25 million people. Not 200 million people, not 250 million people, just 25 million people. I think we'd be able to offer tax holidays to everybody in this room who wants to move to Indonesia. I'm just kidding. That's the kind of hypothetical scenario that we're facing. And the good thing about Indonesia is it's full of Justin Biebers and Selena Gomez's. Very youthful. Somebody was asking me about the politics. By the way, I'll get back to the politics later, but somebody was asking me about the politics earlier. It's quite simple. By next year, there's going to be about 170 million Indonesians who will be female and youthful, who will be eligible to vote. Think about that. They will shape not just the political process, but they will shape the economic process and the social process, the cultural process of Indonesia. There are many challenges for Indonesia. The Gini ratio has ticked up a bit to about 0.4. Still below that of the US, proudly so, but still well above Singapore's, Sweden's, Germany, and many other prosperous countries who've been able to redistribute wealth with equity. And that's, I think, the challenge, midterm and long-term, for Indonesia. How the hell do we use this fiscal space so that everybody gets to enjoy the cake? The MDGs, I think, are likely to be fulfilled by 2015. We'll probably be able to achieve an unemployment rate of 4 to 5% by next year. Poverty rate of about 6 to 7% by next year. Well below whatever rates we used to have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago. I think the next challenge is how to make Indonesia more competitive. More competitive by replacing and embellishing the hopelessly antiquated infrastructure that you might have seen. Anytime anybody wants to see a traffic jam, just come to Jakarta. I guarantee you, there will be a traffic jam most hours of the day. But that's a good problem. Traffic jams are emblematic of economic growth. But the question is anybody thinking about fixing it soon? That's what we've got to figure out. Soon. And as we have fiscally decentralized to the 33 provinces and 497 kabupatens or regencies and municipalities, I think we're on the right track. But the question has always been and will be for a bit with respect to the quality of spending. The quality of spending is off questions here. We're allocating close to 50% of the budget into the regions, but if we did a pulse check yesterday, many of the provincial leaderships, kabupaten leaderships, are still using their budget to buy clothes, to build houses, and to buy cars instead of building roads and power plants and things that would actually help the future of the provincial government and the people within the provinces. That's the kind of quality that we have to basically drive towards going forward. The directionality is clear. It's moving in the right direction. Money-wise, it's being thrown into regions more and more. Yes, there has been leakage. Money-wise, it has been spent on better quality stuff. Yes, it's not where we want it to be. But if we take a 5-10 year view, I think there's a chance that it will be at the level that we want it to be. Now, the last bit is basically the fuel subsidy. We spent about $32 billion on fuel subsidy last year. A lot. A lot of money was spent on fuel subsidy. The question is not economic. I think the President clearly understands what needs to be done. And we actually tried to fix it last year. When we got together with the coalition partners, yes, we shook hands, let's do it. By the time we got to the Parliament, whole different ballgame. Everybody voted in the interest of the political party, not the nation. So I think it's key for us to try to get it done again, the early part of the game in this year, because 2013 is the year of politics, before the bigger year of politics in 2014. Investment has risen, and it's reflective of a better investment climate. Yesterday we announced the latest figures on investment. Indonesia recorded 83 trillion rupees worth of realized investments in the fourth quarter, totaling to about $33 to $34 billion worth of capital formation. 30% of which is local capital formation, 70% FDI. And the good news is, only 17% of FDI was related to mining. The rest is actually going to infrastructure, serves things that actually help Indonesia move up the ladder, move up the value chain. The other good news is money is actually being dispersed out of Java. In 2009, only 18% of total capital formation was invested outside Java. In 2010, it went up to 33%. More money going out of Java. In 2011, 41%. 2012, 46%. 46% of total capital formation took place outside Java. It's good. Not only is the money moving out of Java and being spread all across the 33 provinces, but it's actually being invested in stuff that actually allows us to move up the value chain. And thanks to Singapore, by the way, for being the #1 investor, year by year. Give a big hand to Singapore. And the other guys who get it are the Koreans, the Japanese, and increasingly the Americans. The Americans have shut up to being one of the top 5 investors in Indonesia. They get it. They see this burgeoning economy full of 250 million people who consume. McKinsey issued a report saying that today's 55 million people making up the middle class will only grow to about 115 million people by 2030, positioning Indonesia potentially as the seventh largest economy in the world. The two key drivers of Indonesia's economy have been domestic consumption and investments. And those two are likely to continue in the near foreseeable future.